The day had been long, filled with back-to-back meetings and endless administrative tasks. But Claire Bennett, the FBI chief, finally felt a moment of relief as she left her office. It wasn't often that she could get out before dark, and tonight she planned to take a scenic route home, hoping the peaceful drive would offer some solace from her demanding role. Claire, an accomplished black woman who had worked tirelessly to shatter countless glass ceilings, was used to the weight of her position, but even she needed a moment to breathe. As the city lights blurred into suburban tranquility, she decided to pull over in a quiet neighborhood to answer a call from her deputy. The call wasn't urgent, but Claire's meticulous nature demanded she address any pending issues immediately. Pulling her sleek, unassuming black sedan to the curb, she parked legally beneath a dimly lit street lamp. She glanced at her watch, a habit she couldn't break even after years of running on a tight schedule. Unbeknownst to her, Officer David Reed sat idly in his patrol car just down the street. Reed, a white officer with a reputation for being overly aggressive in predominantly black neighborhoods, spotted her vehicle. His lips curled into a slight sneer as he observed Claire sitting in her car, illuminated faintly by the light of her dashboard. He saw her complexion before anything else and immediately made an assumption in his mind. A lone black woman in an affluent area was automatically suspicious. Claire, engrossed in her call, didn't notice Reed's patrol car until it crept closer, its headlights briefly flashing in her rearview mirror. She finished the call and checked her surroundings, instinctively aware of her environment. Years of training had honed her situational awareness. When the patrol car didn't pass by but instead lingered a few car lengths behind, her instincts kicked in. She sighed softly, already predicting what might unfold. The sound of tires crunching against the asphalt broke the quiet night as Reed pulled up behind her. Claire watched as the officer exited his vehicle, his flashlight slicing through the darkness as he approached her car. She rolled her window down halfway, her calm demeanor masking the irritation simmering beneath the surface. "License and registration," Reed barked, his tone clipped and authoritative. He didn't bother with pleasantries, and his demeanor made it clear that this wasn't a routine traffic stop. It was an assertion of power. "Good evening, officer," Claire said evenly, keeping her hands visible on the steering wheel. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" "You're obstructing traffic," Reed replied curtly, shining his flashlight directly into her face. "Parked illegally in a no-standing zone." Claire raised an eyebrow, glancing pointedly at the curb where her car was legally parked. She resisted the urge to challenge him outright, knowing that escalation could lead to unnecessary complications. Instead, she reached into her glove compartment for her registration, moving slowly and deliberately. "I believe this is a legal parking spot," she said calmly, handing over her documents along with her driver's license. Reed barely glanced at the papers before stepping back and scrutinizing her vehicle. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, ignoring her statement. "This isn't exactly the kind of neighborhood you see folks like you in." Claire's jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure. "I was taking a call before continuing my drive home," she explained. "Is that against the law?" Reed smirked, his flashlight now focused on the interior of her car. "Seems suspicious to me," he muttered. "Why don't you step out of the vehicle?" Claire hesitated. She knew her rights, and she knew there was no legal justification for his request. But she also knew that refusing could escalate the situation. With a calm breath, she opened her door and stepped out. Her professional attire, a tailored pantsuit and heels, contrasting sharply with the officer's aggressive posture. Reed's eyes narrowed as he took in her appearance. He seemed momentarily taken aback, perhaps expecting something that would validate his bias. When no such validation came, his tone grew sharper. "Hands where I can see them," he ordered. Claire complied, raising her hands slightly. "Officer, may I ask again why you've pulled me over?" "I don't like your attitude," Reed snapped. "I ask the questions, not you." The tension was palpable now, drawing the attention of a few residents peeking from their windows. Reed, emboldened by the perceived power imbalance, stepped closer. "What's in your trunk? Got anything you shouldn't have?" Claire's patience was wearing thin. but she knew better than to let her frustration show. "I assure you there's nothing illegal in my car," she replied evenly. "But if you feel the need to search, I'd like to request a warrant." Reed scoffed. "You don't get to make demands here." Before she could respond, another car passed by slowly, its occupants clearly watching the interaction. Claire caught sight of a phone held up through the window, recording the encounter. The presence of witnesses gave her a small measure of reassurance, though it did little to ease the anger simmering beneath her calm facade. Reed, noticing the onlookers, seemed to grow more agitated. "Step to the side," he barked, gesturing toward the sidewalk. Claire complied, her movements measured and deliberate as she stood under the street lamp. Reed circled her car like a predator stalking its prey. Claire could feel the weight of his gaze, his attempts to assert dominance clear in every action. She bit the inside of her cheek, reminding herself of the bigger picture. This wasn't about her alone. This was about the countless others who had faced similar treatment without the means to fight back. "Stay here," Reed ordered, retreating to his patrol car. He sat inside for several minutes, likely running her information through the system. Claire used the time to steady herself, her mind already turning over the steps she would take after this encounter. She knew the system, and she knew how to navigate it better than most. When Reed returned, his expression was unreadable. "You're free to go," he said begrudgingly, handing back her documents. "But next time, don't park where you're not supposed to." Claire accepted her papers with a polite nod. "Thank you, officer. Have a good evening." She returned to her car, her movements calm and composed. But as she pulled away, her grip on the steering wheel tightened. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The encounter had left her humiliated and angry, but it had also reignited her determination. Reed's behavior was a symptom of a much larger problem, one she was uniquely positioned to address. As she drove home, her mind raced with plans to ensure accountability, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been unjustly targeted. This was just the beginning. Claire Bennett spent the night replaying the events of the traffic stop in her mind. It wasn't the first time she'd faced discrimination, but this particular incident struck a nerve. As the FBI chief, she was well versed in the intricacies of the justice system. Yet moments like this reminded her how deeply ingrained racial prejudice was within law enforcement. By morning, she resolved to address what had happened with a clear and calculated approach. Her anger, while justified, would serve no purpose unless channeled into action. She reached for her phone and dialed David Price, her trusted partner and a fellow FBI agent who had worked alongside her for years. "Morning, David," Claire began, her tone clipped but steady. "Claire, you don't usually call this early. Everything okay?" David's voice was warm but tinged with concern. "Not really. I had a run-in with a patrol officer last night." David Reed. "He pulled me over for no reason, escalated the situation, and humiliated me in public." David sighed, the weight of her words settling between them. "I've heard of him. Got a reputation for profiling people, especially in neighborhoods where he thinks they don't belong. What are you thinking?" "I want to handle this the right way," Claire said firmly. "No personal vendettas. I'll file a formal complaint. But I also want to investigate his track record. Something about his behavior felt too familiar, like it wasn't an isolated incident." David didn't hesitate. "I'm in. Let me know how you want to proceed." Later that morning, Claire made her way to the precinct where Reed was stationed, dressed in another tailored suit. She exuded authority, though she kept her role as FBI chief under wraps for now. She wasn't there to make a scene, at least not yet. Inside the precinct, the atmosphere was typical. Busy officers shuffling papers, phones ringing, and an air of controlled chaos. Claire approached the front desk, where a young officer glanced up at her with mild curiosity. "Good morning," she began politely. "I'm here to file a formal complaint against one of your officers." David Reed. The officer's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of unease crossing his face. "Let me get someone to assist you," he said, disappearing into the back. Minutes later, a tall, broad-shouldered man emerged, his badge identifying him as Sergeant Robert Carter. His demeanor was professional but guarded as he extended a hand. Ms. Bennett, I'm Sergeant Carter. I understand you'd like to file a complaint. That's correct, Claire replied, shaking his hand firmly. She handed over the documentation she had prepared, including a detailed account of the previous night's events. I believe Officer Reed's behavior warrants an investigation. His actions were unprofessional and potentially unlawful. Carter glanced over the documents, his brow furrowing. We take these matters seriously. Ms. Bennett, I assure you, your complaint will be reviewed thoroughly. Claire nodded, noting the practiced tone in his voice. She had heard similar reassurances before, and while she hoped for genuine accountability, she wasn't naive. Thank you, Sergeant. I'll be following up to ensure proper action is taken. As she left the precinct, Claire's mind was already working through her next steps. Filing the complaint was only the beginning. She needed to dig deeper, and for that, she'd need David's help. That afternoon, Claire and David met in a quiet cafe, their laptops open and ready. David had already begun gathering information on Reed, and the results were troubling. Look at this, David said, turning his screen toward Claire. He's had multiple complaints filed against him: racial profiling, excessive force, intimidation, but none of them went anywhere. Claire leaned in, scanning the records. Internal investigations cleared him every time. Convenient. David nodded grimly. It gets worse. I pulled some financial records. There's a discrepancy in his income versus his reported salary. It's not huge, but it's enough to raise eyebrows. Claire's eyes narrowed. Could be bribes, side deals, or something else entirely. Either way, it's worth investigating. Let's dig into his connections, associates, past cases, anything that might give us leverage. The two agents worked methodically, piecing together a profile of Reed's career. Patterns began to emerge. He targeted minorities disproportionately, often in affluent neighborhoods where he seemed determined to assert control. His reports were filled with vague justifications for stops and arrests, and his aggressive behavior was a common thread. As the hours passed, Claire felt a growing sense of urgency. Reed wasn't just a rogue officer. He was a symptom of a larger problem. If the precinct had allowed him to continue unchecked, it meant the system itself was complicit. That evening, Claire called David again. I think we need to go further, she said. Filing a complaint won't be enough. We need solid evidence, something irrefutable. I agree, David replied, but we'll have to be careful. If Reed or anyone else in his circle gets wind of this, they'll try to cover their tracks. Claire's mind raced. What about a sting operation? We could set up a scenario that forces him to show his true colors. If we can catch him in the act, it'll be impossible to deny. David hesitated. It's risky, but it could work. We need airtight planning and a good cover story. Let's start brainstorming. As the days passed, Claire and David laid the groundwork for their plan. They identified key locations where Reed frequently patrolled using data from his previous stops. They also enlisted the help of a trusted informant who had experienced racial profiling firsthand and was willing to participate in the operation. Meanwhile, Claire continued to monitor the progress of her formal complaint. Sergeant Carter provided updates, but his responses were vague, and she suspected the precinct was dragging its feet. It only strengthened her resolve to pursue the sting operation. One evening, as Claire reviewed the latest findings, she received a call from David. I've got something, he said. Reed's been meeting with a group of officers off the record. No official reports, just casual gatherings at a diner. But one of our informants says they've overheard talk about quotas and targeting specific neighborhoods. Claire's pulse quickened. That's exactly the kind of thing we need to expose. Let's focus on those meetings. If we can get recordings or corroborate their conversations, it'll be a game changer. As Claire prepared for the next phase of their plan, she couldn't shake the memory of Reed's smirk during their encounter. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every person he had targeted and the countless others who had suffered similar treatment. Her position gave her a platform, but she knew the fight for justice required more than authority. It required courage, persistence, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Claire wasn't backing down. This was only the beginning, and she was ready for whatever came next. The tension in the air was palpable as Claire Bennett and David Price reviewed their preparations for the sting operation. Every detail had been meticulously planned. Yet Claire couldn't shake the weight of what was to come. She knew this wasn't just about exposing David Reed. It was about dismantling the systemic racism that enabled him and countless others to operate unchecked. The operation was set to take place on one of Reed's regular patrol routes, a stretch of road notorious for baseless traffic stops involving black drivers. The plan was simple: use an informant to bait Reed into making an unjustified stop, capturing everything on hidden cameras and microphones. The evidence had to be indisputable. As evening approached, David coordinated with the informant, Tyrone Grant, a local delivery driver who had volunteered to participate. Tyrone had experienced racial profiling by Reed before and was eager to help. Driving an older model car with a small dent in the rear bumper, Tyrone was instructed to travel down Reed's patrol road, adhering strictly to traffic laws. Claire and David positioned themselves nearby in an unmarked van, monitoring the operation through live feeds from the hidden cameras. The tension in the van was thick as they waited for Reed's patrol car to appear. "Do you think he'll take the bait?" David asked, his eyes glued to the screen. Claire's expression was steely. "If his pattern holds, he won't be able to resist." It didn't take long. Reed's patrol car appeared on the live feed, cruising slowly behind Tyrone's vehicle. The officer's demeanor was instantly recognizable, his predatory gaze locked onto the car ahead of him. Within moments, the flashing red and blue lights lit up the night, and Tyrone obediently pulled over to the side of the road. "Here we go," Claire murmured, her fingers gripping the edge of the console. Reed approached Tyrone's car with his characteristic swagger, flashlight in hand. "License and registration," he barked, his tone sharp and impatient. Tyrone complied, his hands trembling slightly as he handed over the documents. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice steady despite the tension. "You tell me," Reed replied, glancing at the paperwork without any real scrutiny. "This car looks like it's seen better days." "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" Reed demanded. Tyrone hesitated, carefully choosing his words. "I'm making a delivery," he said, gesturing to the uniform he wore. "Is there an issue with my driving?" Reed's eyes narrowed, his flashlight darting around the interior of the car. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered abruptly. In the van, David muttered a curse under his breath. "He's escalating, just like we thought." Claire's jaw tightened. "Stay calm, Tyrone," she whispered, even though he couldn't hear her. She knew how quickly situations like this could spiral out of control. Tyrone stepped out of the car, keeping his hands visible. Reed began a so-called inspection, peering into the windows and opening the car doors without permission. The entire scene was captured on the hidden cameras, every action meticulously documented. As the search continued, Reed's tone grew increasingly aggressive. "What's in the trunk?" he demanded. Tyrone hesitated. "Nothing but delivery packages. You're welcome to check, but I'd prefer if we followed proper protocol." Reed's face twisted with irritation. "Proper protocol? Are you telling me how to do my job?" In the van, David clenched his fists. "He's pushing him." Claire nodded grimly. "And it's all on camera." Ignoring Tyrone's protests, Reed popped the trunk and rummaged through its contents, scattering packages carelessly. Finally, he turned back to Tyrone, his expression smug. "Looks like you're clean this time, but I'll be keeping an eye on you." Tyrone's composure cracked just slightly, his voice tinged with frustration. "I haven't done anything wrong, officer. You've made that clear yourself." Reed's smirk faded, replaced by a flash of anger. "Watch your tone," he snapped, stepping closer. "I could make your life very difficult if I wanted to." The threat hung in the air, heavy and unmistakable. Tyrone, to his credit, held his ground, his gaze steady despite the obvious intimidation. As Reed finally returned to his patrol car and drove away, Tyrone got back into his vehicle, his hands shaking as he gripped the steering wheel. In the van, Claire and David exhaled simultaneously, the tension in the air finally breaking. "We got it," David said, his voice filled with a mix of relief and anger. "Everything we need to nail him." Claire nodded, her mind already racing ahead. This is just the start. We'll need to compile this evidence and tie it to his broader pattern of misconduct. Reed isn't acting alone. This is systemic. The following morning, Claire and David presented their findings to their team at the FBI. The video footage, audio recordings, and Reed's history of complaints painted a damning picture. With the evidence in hand, Claire prepared to confront the precinct leadership, determined to hold Reed and his enablers accountable. When she arrived at the precinct, Sergeant Robert Carter greeted her with a mix of surprise and unease. He clearly hadn't expected her to return so soon, let alone with such a powerful arsenal of evidence. "Sergeant Carter," Claire began, her tone calm but firm. "I believe we need to have a conversation about Officer David Reed." Carter's expression tightened. "Ms. Bennett, as I mentioned before, we're taking your complaint seriously." "This isn't about a complaint," Claire interrupted, sliding a folder of documents across the desk. "This is about systemic misconduct and abuse of power within your department. Officer Reed isn't an anomaly. He's a symptom of a much larger problem." Carter opened the folder, his eyes scanning the evidence. His face paled as the weight of the situation became clear. This is serious." "Exactly," Claire replied. "And it's not going away. I suggest you cooperate fully because the next steps will involve federal oversight." As she left the precinct, Claire felt a sense of both relief and determination. The evidence was undeniable, and the wheels of justice were finally in motion. But she knew the battle was far from over. Reed and his enablers wouldn't go down without a fight, and the road ahead would be long and arduous. For Claire, though, there was no turning back. This wasn't just about one corrupt officer. It was about dismantling the systems that allowed him to thrive, and she was ready to see it through to the end. Claire Bennett walked into FBI headquarters with the quiet resolve of someone who knew the stakes of her next move. The confrontation with David Reed had been personal, but now it was about something much larger. With the evidence in hand, Claire was ready to begin exposing not just Reed, but the deeply ingrained rot within his precinct. She entered the briefing room where David Price and a small team of trusted agents were already waiting. A wall of screens displayed key evidence from the sting operation: footage of Reed unlawfully searching the vehicle, recordings of his aggressive tone and his thinly veiled threats. They had worked tirelessly to piece together Reed's pattern of misconduct. But the most damning evidence was still to come. "We're ready," David said as Claire took her seat at the head of the table. "The connections are becoming clearer." "Good," Claire replied. "Let's get started." David stood and tapped a few keys on his laptop, pulling up a diagram on the main screen. "We've been analyzing Reed's financials, and there are clear irregularities. His official salary doesn't match the lifestyle he's maintaining: expensive cars, frequent vacations, and even a second property in his wife's name." Claire leaned forward. "And the source of the extra income?" "We've traced several transactions to a real estate developer," David explained. "This developer has ties to the precinct, specifically Reed and a few other officers. It appears they've been receiving payments to intimidate residents and push them out of certain neighborhoods." Claire's eyes narrowed. Gentrification through intimidation. They're weaponizing the law to displace communities. "Exactly," David confirmed. "The evidence ties Reed to at least 3 incidents where Black families were harassed, ticketed for minor infractions, or arrested under dubious circumstances. The families eventually moved out, and within months, the properties were sold to the same developer." Claire's stomach churned. It was worse than she'd imagined. What about his internal complaints? Were they buried deliberately? David nodded grimly. Most of them never made it past his direct supervisor, Sergeant Robert Carter. He signed off on every internal investigation, clearing Reed of any wrongdoing. Either Carter's complicit, or he's been turning a blind eye. Claire knew they couldn't take on this operation alone. The scale of corruption required careful navigation and broader support. That afternoon, she reached out to Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Lynn, someone she trusted to handle sensitive cases with integrity. Rachel had a reputation for taking on tough cases and winning, and Claire knew she would see the importance of dismantling systemic abuse. "Rachel," Claire greeted her over the phone. "It's been a while." What's going on? I need your help, Claire said, diving straight into the details. She outlined the operation, the evidence they collected, and the connections to the real estate developer. Rachel's voice grew serious. This is big, Claire. If what you're saying is true, it's not just about one corrupt officer. This could implicate the entire precinct and beyond. Exactly, Claire said. But we need to handle this carefully. If they catch wind of the investigation, they'll bury the evidence and close ranks. Rachel agreed to review the files and join the effort. With the U.S. Attorney's Office involved, Claire felt the pieces falling into place. Claire and David decided it was time to confront Sergeant Carter directly. They arrived at the precinct unannounced, their presence immediately drawing attention. Officers glanced at them curiously, whispers spreading through the room. Carter met them in his office, his expression guarded. Chief Bennett, Agent Price, to what do I owe the visit? Claire placed a folder on his desk and sat across from him. Sergeant Carter, we've uncovered evidence of corruption within your precinct. Officer Reed is at the center, but it doesn't stop with him. We need your cooperation. Carter's face remained impassive, but Claire didn't miss the slight tightening of his jaw. I don't know what you're implying, but I assure you, we take complaints seriously. This isn't just about complaints, David interjected. This is about systemic abuse of power, intimidation, racial profiling, and illegal financial activities. And we have evidence that suggests you've been complicit. Carter's calm facade cracked. Now hold on. Are you accusing me of being involved? We're presenting you with an opportunity, Claire said, her voice steady. Work with us, and you can help dismantle the corruption in this precinct. Or you can protect yourself and watch the entire department crumble around you. Carter leaned back in his chair, his gaze flickering between Claire and David. For a moment, the room was silent. Finally, he sighed heavily. What do you need? With Carter reluctantly on board, Claire and David gained access to internal files that painted an even grimmer picture. Officers under Reed's command had operated with impunity for years, targeting vulnerable communities and fabricating charges to justify their actions. The patterns were undeniable, and the scale of the operation was staggering. One file stood out, a series of complaints from a black family who had been forced out of their home after months of harassment. The details mirrored Tyrone's experience, and Claire felt a surge of determination. This family, like so many others, had been victimized by a system designed to protect them. As they continued their investigation, David discovered a critical piece of evidence, a recording of a meeting between Reed and the real estate developer. The conversation was explicit, detailing payments and strategies for driving out residents. It was the smoking gun they needed. With the evidence in hand, Claire and her team prepared to execute the next phase of their plan. A sting operation would target not only Reed, but also his associates and the developer. The goal was to catch them in the act, ensuring there was no way to deny their involvement. Claire met with Rachel and David late into the night, mapping out every detail. This has to be airtight, Claire said. If they find even a single loophole, they'll use it to their advantage. We'll get it done, Rachel assured her. This isn't just about justice for the victims. It's about setting a precedent. We can't let this kind of abuse continue. As the meeting ended, Claire felt a sense of both anticipation and trepidation. The operation was risky, and the stakes couldn't be higher, but she knew there was no turning back. That night, as Claire sat alone in her office, she thought about the countless people who had suffered because of officers like Reed. She thought about her own experience, the humiliation she had endured, and the anger that had fueled her resolve. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had been silenced, every family who had been torn apart, and every community that had been displaced. And now, it was about holding the system accountable. The unveiling of the truth was just the beginning. The real fight was about to begin. The evidence was mounting, and the picture it painted was more disturbing than even Claire Bennett had anticipated. The corruption in Officer David Reed's precinct wasn't just limited to his actions. It was a well-oiled machine of systemic abuse and manipulation that spanned years. What began as a single complaint had unraveled into a vast web of deceit, implicating not only Reed, but also other officers and external collaborators like the real estate developer. Claire and David worked tirelessly, poring over documents, financial records, and internal memos. The precinct, once a symbol of community protection, was now exposed as a hub for exploitation. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that Reed wasn't working alone. His actions were symptomatic of a culture of corruption. David laid out a chart on the conference table, a sprawling diagram connecting names, incidents, and transactions. At the center was Reed, with lines branching out to other officers and the developer. "We're looking at a tight-knit group," David explained. "Reed isn't just a rogue cop. He's part of an inner circle that's been operating with impunity. They've turned this precinct into their own personal racket." Claire studied the chart, her brow furrowed. "Who else is involved?" "For other officers, for sure," David replied, pointing to the names. "And then there's the developer, Franklin Hayes. He's been funneling money to these officers to intimidate residents and clear out neighborhoods for his projects. The properties are flipped and sold at massive profits." Claire's lips pressed into a thin line. This is gentrification by force. They're not just abusing their power, they're destroying lives. As the investigation continued, David uncovered a series of emails between Reed and Hayes. The correspondence revealed how Hayes orchestrated the harassment campaigns, targeting specific families who had refused to sell their homes. The language in the emails was chillingly casual, discussing tactics like bogus citations, late-night intimidation, and arrests under false pretenses. "What kind of person writes this like it's a business plan?" David muttered, disgusted. "A person who thinks they're untouchable," Claire replied. "That stops now." One particular email stood out. It detailed an upcoming meeting at a local diner where Reed and Hayes were set to discuss their next steps. This was the opportunity Claire and her team needed. Claire convened her team to strategize. The goal was to catch Reed and Hayes in the act, securing incontrovertible evidence of their conspiracy. Rachel Lynn, the assistant U.S. attorney, joined the meeting, bringing her expertise to the table. "This meeting is our chance to expose everything," Rachel said, "but we have to be meticulous. If they even suspect they're being watched, they'll clam up." Claire nodded. "We'll use undercover agents to monitor the conversation and capture the evidence." "David, can we plant surveillance equipment at the diner?" "Already on it," David replied. "I've got a tech team setting up hidden microphones and cameras. We'll have eyes and ears on everything." The team also arranged for backup units to be on standby, ready to make arrests if necessary. Every detail was scrutinized, ensuring there were no loose ends. The night of the sting was tense. Claire and David sat in the unmarked van parked near the diner, monitoring the live feeds from the hidden cameras inside. Two undercover agents posed as patrons, blending seamlessly into the crowd. Reed arrived first, his expression smug as he took a seat in a booth near the back. Minutes later, Franklin Hayes walked in, his tailored suit and confident stride exuding wealth and arrogance. The two men greeted each other with a handshake before settling into their discussion. "Here we go," David whispered, his eyes glued to the monitor. The conversation was damning from the start. Reed and Hayes spoke openly about their plans to target a new neighborhood, referencing specific families by name. They discussed strategies for forcing residents out, from bogus citations to threats of arrest. "I want that block cleared by the end of the month," Hayes said, his tone businesslike. "The investors are ready to move, and I don't want any delays." Reed nodded. "Consider it done. My guys know what to do." The casualness of their exchange was infuriating, and Claire clenched her fists as she listened. These men spoke about ruining lives as though they were discussing a routine business transaction. As the conversation continued, Claire signaled the backup units to move into position. The time had come to act. Inside the diner, the undercover agents discreetly exited, leaving Reed and Hayes unaware of what was about to happen. Moments later, uniformed officers entered through the front and back doors, blocking any escape routes. "David Reed, Franklin Hayes," one of the officers announced. "You're under arrest for conspiracy, corruption, and abuse of power." The look of shock on Reed's face was priceless. his smug demeanor evaporating in an instant. Hayes tried to protest, claiming there was a misunderstanding, but the officers ignored him. Both men were handcuffed and escorted out, their arrogance replaced by panic. In the van, David let out a triumphant cheer. "We got them." Claire allowed herself a small smile, but her focus remained sharp. "This is just the beginning. Now we bring the entire system down." With Reed and Hayes in custody, the FBI launched a full-scale investigation into the precinct. The arrest sent shockwaves through the department, and other officers implicated in the corruption began to crack under pressure. Facing overwhelming evidence, many opted to cooperate. Providing further details about the operation, Claire and her team worked tirelessly to compile the evidence, ensuring there were no gaps in the case. Rachel Lynn prepared to bring charges against not only Reed and Hayes, but also the officers and officials who had enabled their actions. The community, once silenced by fear, began to come forward with their stories. Residents shared accounts of harassment, intimidation, and displacement, painting a vivid picture of the damage caused by the corruption. Their voices became a rallying cry for justice, fueling Claire's determination. As the week drew to a close, Claire stood in the precinct's conference room, addressing a group of officers who had not been implicated in the corruption. Her tone was firm but resolute. "This department has been complicit in systemic abuse," she said. "It's time to rebuild, not just for the community, but for the integrity of law enforcement. We have a responsibility to ensure this never happens again." Her words were met with solemn nods, the weight of the moment sinking in. The path ahead would be difficult, but Claire knew it was necessary. As she left the precinct that day, Claire felt a sense of accomplishment tempered by the knowledge that the fight wasn't over. The web of corruption had been exposed, but the work of dismantling it and rebuilding trust would take time. For Claire, there was no alternative. Justice demanded perseverance, and she was ready to see it through. The arrests of David Reed and Franklin Hayes were only the tip of the iceberg. As Claire Bennett reviewed the unfolding investigation, it became clear that the depth of corruption extended far beyond what they had initially uncovered. The web of misconduct implicated several high-ranking officers within the precinct, all of whom had either directly participated in or turned a blind eye to the systemic abuse. The task ahead was monumental. Claire's team had amassed enough evidence to charge Reed and Hayes, but the real challenge lay in dismantling the entire corrupt structure without tipping off those still under investigation. To achieve this, they needed a trap that would expose the remaining players. Seated in a conference room at FBI headquarters, Claire and David convened with Rachel Lynn, the assistant U.S. attorney, and a small team of investigators. The energy in the room was tense but purposeful, the stakes higher than ever. "We've got Reed and Hayes locked down," Rachel began, her voice steady, "but the fallout from their arrests is already causing ripples. Some of the officers involved are starting to get nervous, which means they might make mistakes. That's where we come in," Claire said, her tone firm. "We need to leverage their fear to force them into action. If we can get them to incriminate themselves, we'll have everything we need to bring this operation to a close." David leaned forward, tapping a folder on the table. "We've been monitoring communications within the precinct. There's chatter about a meeting, an emergency session called by one of the lieutenants, Carl Devins, who's been implicated in the investigation. They're trying to regroup and figure out their next steps." Claire's eyes narrowed. "Where's the meeting taking place?" "At a private warehouse on the outskirts of town," David replied. "It's off the books, and they think it's safe." Rachel smirked. "Perfect. That's where we set the trap." The operation hinged on infiltrating the meeting without alerting the participants. Claire and David worked with the FBI's technical team to rig the warehouse with hidden cameras and microphones. The goal was to capture the officers in the act of discussing their illicit activities, providing irrefutable evidence of their complicity. "We'll place undercover agents nearby to monitor the situation," Claire explained during the briefing. "If things go sideways, they'll intervene. But the priority is to gather as much intel as possible." Rachel nodded. "And what about Reed and Hayes? Do we use their cooperation?" Claire hesitated. Reed and Hayes had agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences, but their motives were self-serving at best. Let's hold off for now. We can use their statements later to corroborate what we find. The night of the meeting arrived, and the team moved into position. The warehouse was a nondescript building surrounded by abandoned lots, its isolation making it an ideal location for clandestine gatherings. Claire and David sat in the surveillance van parked a safe distance away, their eyes glued to the live feed from the hidden cameras inside the warehouse. Lieutenant Carl Devins stood at the center of a makeshift conference table, flanked by 3 other officers. Their body language was tense, their voices low as they began to discuss the fallout from Reed and Hayes' arrests. "This whole thing is spiraling out of control," Devins said, his tone agitated. "Reed should have kept his mouth shut. Now the feds are breathing down our necks." One of the officers, Mike Reynolds, crossed his arms. "What do you expect us to do? They've got evidence. If they dig too deep, we're all screwed." Devins shot him a glare. "We need to cover our tracks. Destroy anything that ties us to Hayes or the other deals. And for God's sake, keep your stories straight." In the van, David muttered under his breath, "They're panicking." Claire nodded. "Good. Let them unravel themselves." As the meeting progressed, one of the officers, Lisa Grayson, spoke up. Unlike the others, her tone carried a hint of hesitation. "Maybe it's time we come clean. This isn't just about us anymore. People are getting hurt. Families displaced. Is this really worth it?" Devins slammed his hand on the table. "Don't get soft on me now. Grayson, you knew what you were signing up for." "I didn't sign up for this." Grayson shot back. "It was supposed to be about protecting our community, not tearing it apart." Her words struck a nerve, and the room grew quiet. In the van, Claire leaned forward, her instincts telling her that Grayson might be a potential ally. "We need to bring her in," Claire said quietly. "She could be the key to breaking this wide open." David nodded. "I'll keep tabs on her after this." The tension in the warehouse reached a boiling point as the officers debated their next steps. Devins, desperate to maintain control, began issuing directives for destroying evidence and silencing potential witnesses. Every word was captured on the hidden cameras, the audio crystal clear. "Burn the files," Devins ordered. "And if anyone asks questions, we play dumb. Nobody talks to the feds." "Got it?" The other officers nodded reluctantly, their fear overriding any sense of morality. It was the moment Claire had been waiting for. "Move in," she ordered. Within seconds, the warehouse was surrounded by FBI agents and local law enforcement. The officers inside barely had time to react before the doors were breached, and they were placed under arrest. Devins' face twisted in fury as he was handcuffed, his bravado evaporating. "You won't get away with this," he shouted as he was led out. Claire stepped into the warehouse, her presence commanding. "You already did," she said coldly. "And now it's over." The raid yielded more than just arrests. The team recovered files, laptops, and other materials that provided further evidence of the corruption. The data painted a damning picture, linking the officers to multiple instances of abuse, bribery, and intimidation. As the evidence was cataloged, Claire felt a surge of satisfaction. The trap had worked perfectly, and the foundation of the corrupt network was crumbling. Back at headquarters, Claire and Rachel reviewed the footage from the operation. The conversations captured during the meeting were enough to secure convictions, and Grayson's reluctance to participate hinted at the possibility of a willing witness. "We should approach Grayson," Rachel suggested. "If she's willing to testify, it'll strengthen our case even further." Claire agreed. "We'll bring her in for questioning. If she's genuine, she could help us take this all the way." As the team prepared for the next phase of the operation, Claire couldn't help but reflect on how far they'd come. The arrests of Devins and his crew were a significant victory, but the battle was far from over. Systemic corruption didn't end with a single operation. It required sustained effort and vigilance. For Claire, the fight was personal. She had seen the damage caused by abuse of power, and she was determined to ensure that justice prevailed. The trap had been set, and the web of corruption was unraveling. Now it was time to finish the job. The arrest at the warehouse sent shockwaves through the precinct and beyond. Lieutenant Carl Devins, and his inner circle were charged with conspiracy, destruction of evidence, and abuse of power. The media quickly picked up the story. As the scandal unfolded, it became clear that this was more than just a local issue. It was a systemic failure that demanded accountability at every level. For Claire Bennett, this was the moment she had been working toward. The hard evidence her team had gathered would ensure that justice was served, but she knew the fight wasn't over. The fallout from the arrests had created ripples of fear and uncertainty, and there were still pieces of the puzzle left to uncover. One of the most significant breakthroughs came when Lisa Grayson, the reluctant officer from the warehouse meeting, agreed to cooperate. Her decision wasn't immediate. She had been hesitant, fearing retaliation and the loss of her career. But when approached by Claire and David, she realized that telling the truth was her best chance at redemption. In a quiet interrogation room at FBI headquarters, Grayson sat across from Claire, her posture tense but her resolve firm. "I didn't sign up for this," she began, her voice steady. "I became a cop to help people, not to be part of some corrupt system." Claire nodded, her tone measured. "We believe you, Lisa, and we're here to help you do the right thing. Your testimony could make all the difference in bringing down the people who orchestrated this." Grayson took a deep breath. "I'll tell you everything I know." Over the next several hours, Grayson detailed the inner workings of the corrupt network. She revealed how Devins and his associates had manipulated the system to their advantage, perpetuating a cycle of abuse and corruption that had gone unchecked for years. With her cooperation, the case against the remaining officers grew stronger, and the path to justice became clearer. And Hunt had manipulated younger officers using intimidation and promises of protection to coerce them into compliance. She also provided critical information about Franklin Hayes' involvement, including specifics about the bribes and the families targeted for displacement. Her testimony was a goldmine, filling in gaps in the investigation and providing a roadmap for the final steps in dismantling the operation. While the legal case was being built, the public's attention was firmly fixed on the scandal. News outlets ran story after story about the corruption, highlighting the bravery of the victims who'd come forward. Community leaders organized rallies and town hall meetings, demanding reforms and greater accountability within law enforcement. Claire attended one such meeting, invited by local activists who saw her as a symbol of hope and resilience. Standing before a packed room, she spoke about the importance of standing up against injustice and holding those in power accountable. "This is not just about a few bad actors," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "It's about dismantling a system that allows this kind of abuse to happen. Change doesn't come easily, but it starts with each of us demanding better for ourselves, our families, and our communities." Her words were met with applause and cheers, but Claire knew that the real work was happening behind the scenes. The fight for justice was far from over. As the investigation progressed, the case against Devins, Reed, and Hayes grew stronger. Rachel Lynn, the assistant U.S. attorney, spearheaded the prosecution, meticulously building a case that left no room for doubt. The trial was set to be a high-profile event, drawing attention from across the country. In the days leading up to the trial, Claire and David worked tirelessly to ensure every piece of evidence was airtight. The video footage from the warehouse meeting, combined with Grayson's testimony and the financial records tying Hayes to the precinct, created a damning narrative. The trial itself was a spectacle. The prosecution laid out the evidence with precision, detailing how the defendants had conspired to exploit their positions for personal gain. Witnesses testified about the harassment and intimidation they had endured, their voices unwavering as they recounted their experiences. Grayson's testimony was a turning point. Facing her former colleagues, she spoke with honesty and conviction, detailing how she had been coerced into participating in the corruption. Her willingness to take responsibility for her actions added weight to her words, and the jury listened intently. When the defense tried to discredit her, Grayson remained composed. "I made mistakes," she admitted, "but I'm here to make them right, and I won't let these men destroy any more lives." After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Devins, Reed, and Hayes were found guilty on multiple charges, including conspiracy, bribery, and abuse of power. The sentencing was severe. reflecting the gravity of their crimes and the harm they had caused. As the verdict was read, Claire felt a wave of relief wash over her. Justice had been served, but she knew that the fight against systemic corruption was ongoing. The convictions were a step forward, but there was still much work to be done. The fallout from the trial prompted a wave of reforms within the precinct and beyond. Policies were implemented to increase transparency and accountability, including mandatory body cameras, independent oversight committees, and stricter protocols for handling complaints. Claire played a key role in shaping these reforms, drawing on her experiences to advocate for meaningful change. She worked closely with community leaders and law enforcement officials, ensuring that the voices of those affected by the corruption were heard. The precinct underwent a complete overhaul, with new leadership committed to restoring trust and integrity and a renewed commitment to serving the community. For the first time in years, residents began to feel a sense of trust in the system. In the aftermath of the trial, Claire took a rare moment to reflect on the journey. She thought about the victims who had shown incredible courage in coming forward, the officers who had chosen integrity over fear, and the community that had rallied together to demand justice. Sitting in her office late one evening, Claire glanced at the folder containing the final report on the case. It was a reminder of how far they had come and how much further they had to go. The reckoning had been necessary, painful, and transformative, and while the fight for justice was never truly over, Claire knew that this victory was worth celebrating. For her, it wasn't just about holding people accountable, it was about building a better future, one step at a time. The sun was setting as Claire Bennett sat in the precinct's newly renovated conference room. The once dimly lit and neglected space had been transformed into a symbol of change, bright, modern, and welcoming. She looked at the room filled with community leaders, law enforcement officers, and activists. They were gathered for the inaugural meeting of the precinct's new Community Oversight Board, a direct result of the reforms she had fought so hard to implement. Claire stood at the podium, her presence commanding yet approachable. She began to speak, her voice steady and clear. "Today marks a new chapter for this precinct and for our community," she said. "We've confronted hard truths, held people accountable, and taken the first steps toward rebuilding trust. But this is just the beginning. Justice isn't a destination, it's a journey, and it requires all of us to stay vigilant." The crowd nodded, some clapping softly in agreement. Among them, she noticed familiar faces, families who had suffered under the corrupt system, officers who had chosen integrity over complicity, and her own team who had been with her every step of the way. The past few months had been grueling but rewarding. After the convictions of David Reed, Franklin Hayes, and Carl Devins, the precinct underwent a comprehensive audit. Dozens of officers were disciplined or dismissed for their roles in enabling corruption. New policies were implemented to ensure transparency and accountability, including regular external reviews, body cameras, and community training programs. Claire had worked closely with Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Lynn and local leaders to ensure these changes were more than superficial. They had crafted a blueprint for systemic reform, one that could serve as a model for precincts across the country. The newly formed Community Oversight Board was perhaps the most significant achievement, comprising residents, local activists, and law enforcement representatives. The board was tasked with reviewing complaints, monitoring officer conduct, and ensuring that the community's voice was heard. As the meeting concluded, Claire stayed behind, watching as attendees mingled and exchanged ideas. David Price approached her, his usual easygoing demeanor tinged with pride. "You did it," he said, handing her a coffee. "Not just the arrests, not just the trial, but real change." Claire smiled, accepting the cup. "We did it," she corrected. "I couldn't have done this without you, or Rachel, or the community. This was a collective effort." David chuckled. "Still, you were the driving force. You took the worst situation and turned it into something transformative." Claire looked out at the room again, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and humility. "It's not about me," she said. "It's about them, the families who lost their homes, the people who were silenced. This is their victory as much as it's ours." One of the families affected by the corruption approached Claire after the meeting. The Johnsons had been among the first to come forward with their story, detailing how Reed and his team had harassed them until they were forced to sell their home. "Chief Bennett," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I just wanted to thank you for listening, for fighting for us. It means more than you'll ever know." Claire shook her hand warmly. "You're the reason we were able to make this happen," she replied. "Your courage in coming forward set everything in motion. Never underestimate the power of your voice." As the Johnsons left, Claire felt a renewed sense of purpose. Stories like theirs reminded her why she had taken on this fight and why she couldn't stop now. Back at FBI headquarters, Claire met with Rachel and David to discuss the next steps. The success of their operation had drawn national attention, and other communities were reaching out for guidance on implementing similar reforms. Rachel leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "We've set a precedent here, but there's still so much work to do. Corruption like this doesn't exist in isolation." Claire nodded. "We need to build on this momentum, share what we've learned, create frameworks that other precincts can use. This isn't just about fixing one department, it's about transforming the entire system." David grinned. "Sounds like you're ready to take on the world." Claire smiled back. "One step at a time." That evening, Claire returned to her apartment, a rare moment of quiet in her otherwise hectic life. She sat by the window, looking out at the city she had sworn to protect. The weight of her position was always present, but tonight it felt lighter. She thought about the journey, how a routine traffic stop had spiraled into a battle against systemic corruption. She remembered the humiliation she had felt during her encounter with Reed, the anger that had fueled her determination, and the resilience that had carried her through. Claire reached for her journal, something she rarely had time for these days. As she wrote, her thoughts flowed freely. Justice is not about revenge. It's about restoration. It's about righting wrongs, not just for ourselves, but for those who come after us. This fight is far from over, but today we've taken a step forward, and that gives me hope. The next morning, Claire woke early, ready to tackle the day. There were meetings to attend, reports to review, and new initiatives to plan. But as she stood in front of her mirror, adjusting her suit, she allowed herself a moment of pride. This wasn't just a victory for her. It was a victory for the community, for justice, and for the countless people who had been silenced by corruption. And while the road ahead was long, Claire was ready to keep walking it. As she left her apartment and stepped into the bustling streets, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight for justice was never truly over, but for the first time in a long time, Claire felt like they were winning.